Well, I'd like to welcome all of you on this snowy morning here in the Boston area to this talk by a very special guest we have today. This talk is sponsored by the Harvard Department of Celtic Languages and Literatures and by the Mahindra Center for Humanities Celtic Seminar. I am Joseph Knight. Our guest today is someone that well, how shall we put it? He's probably more than a triple threat, as, for example, Judy Garland was. Our guest is a master linguist. He is also a master literary critic, and he is also a remarkable Indo-Europeanist. His work, I'm sure, is familiar to everyone here in this audience. Including the book Pagan Past and Christian Present, which has had such an impact upon the course of Celtic studies. Also his many other important works, such as his discussion of the Old Irish verb, also his various articles on the institution of the fian, and various other male bonding groups in Indo-European cultures. And a recent work I would bring to your attention, if you haven't found it already, is a definitive study of the medieval Irish text Esna the Tia Buchit, which appeared in the journal Zeitschrift für Keltische Philologie very recently. And we are honored to have Professor Kim McCone, whose name I have not mentioned yet, who is the emeritus professor of Old Irish at Maynooth University. We are honored to have Kim preview for us today some forthcoming work of his having to do with one of our favorite early Irish texts, the story of Mcducho's pig, Scéala Wicca Mcducho, and also of a fascinating early medieval Latin poem coming from Germanic tradition, the Vultarius. And he will be comparing these two texts and the body parts to be found therein, and also various aspects of heroic morality. So without further ado, and there will be a handout which will be scrolled in the course of the talk, but also you have now received it via chat, and it will be sent out again in case people come in late for the talk. I present to you our very, very esteemed guest, to whom we are so grateful for appearing among us, Kim McCone.
Well, thank you very much, Yoshi, and I'll get down to this then without more ado. I trust everyone can see whatever they need to see. Scéala Wicca Mcducho is constructed like a sandwich, not to say a ham sandwich. Two outer slices deal with the fate of Mcducho's great hound Alve, and the filling is a feast at which rival boasts for the the privilege of dividing a huge pig end in mayhem. The importance of this middle part to the saga's anonymous but accomplished author is indicated not only by its length and position, but also by the saga's original title, which is in all of the older manuscripts, The Tale of Mcducho's Pig. First, a brief resume of the plot. The Arch-Hospitaller, Mcducho of Leinster, the owner of one of Ireland's 5 or 6 hostels dispensing hospitality to all comers, has a great guard dog named Alve, for which generous offers are made simultaneously by messengers from the island's 2 major powers, the Ulstermen and their bitter Connacht rivals. When his wife asks him why he is upset, Mcducho explains that he cannot give the hound to one side without incurring trouble from the other. She advises him to offer it to both, unbeknown to the other, and then let them fight it out. He duly does this, setting the same day for both to come for the dog. When they turn up, each side is taken aback to see the other, and, in an atmosphere of mutual hostility, all prepare to feast on a huge pig and trimmings provided by their host. The decision to divide the pig on the basis of contests leads to the boasting competition, upon which we will focus after a look at the flanking segments. Once he has won the right to carve the monstrous pig, the Ulsterman, Conall Cernach, slurps its whole belly before insultingly offering just its 2 front legs to the men of Connacht. The ensuing violence and bloodshed soon moved from the hostel's interior to the outside. As the combatants were about to leave the enclosure, Mcducho released his hound to choose between them. Siding with the Ulsterman, the dog seized the rear shafts of the chariot bearing the king and queen of Connacht, Allel and Medov, but a blow from their charioteer, Fairlogher, left its head stuck between the shafts after its body had dropped away. After the head had finally fallen off, Fairlogher jumped down from the chariot, lay in wait, and then jumped into the Ulster King Conchobar's chariot from behind, seizing the king's head and securing his immediate agreement to whatever he desired. Fairlogher chose to return with the king to his capital at Evenvacher for a year, during which the nubile women of Ulster were to regale him nightly with the refrain, "Fairlogher is my darling." The charioteers returned to Connacht with 2 golden bridled steeds of Conchobar's, concludes the tale in which, as I put it on page 78 of Pagan Past and Christian Present, thoroughly unchristian behaviour proves totally futile and counterproductive for all concerned. The ancestry and the artistry and humour of Scalamwicke Mcducho were apparent to the scholars mentioned in A1 on the handout. In his classic Heldensaga, Tornayson reckoned it one of the best narrated sagas, stating that nowhere has the unrestrained pugnacity of the time been more forthrightly expressed. The humorous conclusion also displays the boisterous mood. Chadwick opines that it purports to give a picture of the old heroic life in Ireland and its warlike spirit, suffused with laconic humour and the spirit of right burlesque, as its laughing storyteller turns both these great rival dynasties to ridicule. Buttimer argued for a serious social and political dimension, whereas O'Currine has concentrated upon the jape of a parody of the heroic genre as represented by Tyneboe Coolinge, in which heroic contests become boorish boasting. My own brief treatment in 1990 maintained that, I quote, "For all its decidedly grim humour and moments of bathos, this taut and purposeful tale is no mere burlesque with no aim beyond parody for entertainment's sake, but rather a deadly earnest, if at times amusing, moral satire in the classical tradition, geared by its monastic author to Christian principles." In the 2006 article in German developed this approach with a focus upon the boasting contests at the heart of the tale, and the present paper seeks to advance it further with the help of comparisons with Vultarius, a roughly contemporary Carolingian epic in Latin hexameters. The opening of Scalamwicke contains 2 passages in A2 on the handout, along with biblical parallels. The first states that visitors to Ireland's great hostels, including the coggers, got their food by literal pot luck, in contravention of the normal Irish practice of feeding guests strictly according to their status, as detailed in law tracts, quite meticulously, indeed obsessively. This discrepancy was resolved in other narratives, such as the Coggers Hostel, by having the cauldron automatically give their proper food to guests who stuck their forks in. Whether this motif was deliberately recast in Scalamwicke or other texts made the cauldrons properly class-conscious, the pure pot luck in our tale was hardly traditional. An obvious external source is the Bible's description of the allocation of the priest's sacrificial portion, which introduces an account of how the godless behaviour of Eli's sons led to a disastrous defeat for Israel, in which they were both killed and the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. In the second example, Mcducho's dismay at the rival bids for his hound and recourse to his wife's advice echo King Ahab of Israel's reaction to his failed bid for Naboth's vineyard and acceptance of his wife Jezebel's intervention. Mcducho's wife is thus implicitly equated with one of the Bible's great villainesses, and both women deliberately resort to subterfuge on their indecisive husband's behalf, with deadly consequences. In Scalamwicke, general carnage ensues and the dog is killed, but Mcducho survives, while Naboth dies in the biblical account and Ahab gets his vineyard, but only escapes immediate divine retribution by donning sackcloth and ashes. These echoes are hardly mere ornaments, but rather cues for a similar concern with serious misconduct and its consequences in Scéile Mcducho, which explicitly states that despite the 70 milch cows feeding it for 7 years, the giant pig was, however, being fed on poison so that the slaughter of the men of Ireland might happen for it. As the centrepiece of the Ulster cycle, Táin Bó Cúailnge was the obvious point of reference for a satire upon the genre. Various places are named after the body parts of one bull cast off from the other's horns in their concluding fight to the death in the Táin, and Scéile Mcducho echoes this by commemorating the 2 places where the dead hound Alvis' body and head fell to the ground in the final battle as Alvis Plain and Dog's Head Ford. Moreover, the confrontation of the Connaughta with all of Ulster's leading warriors but Cuchulainn in Mcducho's hostel inverts the situation in the Táin, where Cuchulainn alone confronts the Connaughta, while a periodic debility keeps the other Ulstermen away until the very end of the tale, at least. The role of Ferlogha in the final episode of Scéile Mcducho is remarkable. As Alulan Mether's charioteer, he would normally have been facing forwards doing the driving and leaving any fighting to the passengers. Nevertheless, he was the one who slew the hound when it attacked the rear of the chariot. He then went on to ambush Conchobar from behind and obtain his immediate submission. Thus did a mere servant overshadow two rulers and overcome the third at the end of the conflict. Hitherto, a series of aristocrats, including a king's son, had been demeaned in the boasting contest, to which we'll return, but the satire now moves to the very top of the social scale. The Ulster warriors participating in the boasting contests included the second-ranked Conall Cannach and third-ranked Loigre Buadach, but not their greatest champion. However, the final episode aims its satire at the top of the martial scale too. Since Ferlogha's slaying of Alve inevitably recalls the boy Shadenta's killing of the Smith Cullen's hound and assumption of its protective role to earn his new name Cuchulainn, or Hound of Cullen, in the last but one of his boyhood deeds, told as a flashback in the time. As indicated in A3, Ferlogha's very name was surely intended to invoke Cuchulainn's status as Lug's offspring. However, the Ferlogha episode consistently devalues its model. The dog slayer is an adult underling instead of a precocious young hero. He merely imitates the dead dog's final attack on the rear of a chariot instead of taking over the hound's essential function as a mighty guardian. His elevation is temporary instead of permanent, and whereas the female adulation regularly excited by the older Cuchulainn was genuine, the Ulster women's embarrassing nightly declarations of love for the upstart Ferlogha were bogus, being motivated solely by fear of disobeying Conchobar, as the text states. A woman's advice near the tale's beginning led to men's humiliations and deaths, but at its end it was the turn of women to be humiliated at a man's behest. The article cited in A4 argued that the hound functioned as the quintessence of martial qualities and transmitter of these to its slayer, a role obviously belittled by their dilution on passing to a mere charioteer instead of a true hero. Cuchulainn's feat was compared in the Aereo article with the overcoming of Hades' monstrous hound Cerberus by Heracles, the greatest of Greek heroes, and slayer of a second great hound, Orthus, guarding Geryone's herds on another worldly island. A similar mythical role for the two Irish hounds would follow from O'Reilly's argument that the early Irish hostels guarded by them were the literary reflex of the otherworld feasting hall and a presiding deity still reflected by Da, the proclitic version of Old Irish Dea, God, in most of their proprietors' names. A scheme of great antiquity emerges from a combination of the Irish and Greek data with Schleiermacher's argument from Sanskrit, Norse and Armenian sources for a pair of Proto-Indo-European canine guardians of the underworld. This brings us to A5, and classical authors' accounts of ancient Gaulish feasting and fighting habits that have been compared by Chadwick and others with key features of Schizophrenia Mcducho. Notable among these are gathering under arms, single combats that could get out of hand, a champion's portion liable to be competed for, and confrontational boasting. Hitherto neglected evidence in A6 for the combination of canine sacrifice with fighting and feasting among several Indo-European peoples has recently received striking archaeological support. Striking archaeological support from the study by Anthony and Brown, cited at the end of the section, and indeed at the end of the part on screen, the end of the section, and based upon their excavation of an early 2nd millennium BC site. Fighting has an explicit role in the Macedonian, Hittite, and Spartan examples, while the Roman luperci are not only the ritualized reflex of a youthful warband, but also inflict blows upon bystanders. All four involve the sacrifice of a dog, bitch, or pup. Its cutting in two in the Macedonian and Hittite rituals recalls the hound's fate in Schizophrenia. Whereas the Hittite rite was a response to defeat in actual battle, the other three included a mock battle or the like, and in at least 2 cases, a feast. An inferred prototype seems to be best preserved in the Macedonian rite insofar as at least one other witness supports each of its 3 sequentialist coherent parts: the severing of a dog's head from its body, a division into 2 sides for a mock battle, and a reunifying feast. Schizophrenia's sequence of divisive feast, deadly real battle, and dog's beheading may have been intended as a negative inversion of this traditional pattern by an author set upon debunking such pagan mythical or ritual clouds as trailed in the hound's wake. So much for the canine casing. B turns to the meat of the filling. The section numbers in brackets refer to Tornyson's edition, but here reference will be made to the unbracketed ones ranging from 1 to 9. Daggers, asterisks, boldface, and small capitals signal various correspondences within a carefully constructed sequence. In B1, after a brief series of exchanges between 4 warriors from Connacht and Ulster, Cedd MacMargach of Connacht emerges victorious and prepares to carve the pig. 7 Ulstermen in succession then try and fail to dislodge him. The asterisked episodes opening and closing this sequence, B2 and B8, are linked as first forays into enemy territory undertaken after initiation as a warrior by a rite of Gavor Gashgiv, taking arms. The classic narrative based upon this custom was the precocious Cuchullin's illustrious initial expedition in the last of his boyhood deeds in Timbo Cúlinge, after King Conchobar had granted him first Gashgev, a set of arms comprising a spear and a shield, and then a chariot and horses a day later. In marked cautionary contrast, Loigere and Cúsgrith failed miserably, both being put to flight with spears through them and serious losses. Each of these 2 barely survived initiatory fiascos is separated from a brief central incident featuring 3 decapitations in B5 by 2 episodes that resulted in permanent but non-fatal physical defects. 4 of his unsuccessful opponents in contests 2 to 8 were the direct butt of Cedd's scorn, but the other 3 were demeaned vicariously with reference to the worsting of a close relative, the father in 3 and 6, a son in 5. Cedd's actions may be said to have had only limited lasting effects upon his first 5 adversaries, since even Eoghan in 4 had lost an eye, but evidently not his sight, and the reference to Munriver's dead son as his first or eldest in 5 clearly implies that he still had at least 1 direct male heir. However, the stakes are raised in the last 2 encounters, in which Cedd is confronted by an ugly older and a handsome younger opponent. Celtic's testicular trauma has rendered him incapable of producing an heir in 7. We could do with a slight scroll there, I think. And still higher up the social scale in 8, Cuscrit's prospect of becoming his royal father's heir are vitiated by the need for a king to be eloquent as well as good-looking. While the nature of Loigeris' spear wound is ignored in the first contest, different types of invisible but permanent physical damage are specified in the final 2, and the very visible loss of various body parts figures in the intervening 3 to 6, translated verbatim as the focus of comparison with Vultarius. Mahindra and Celtic got second bites of the cherry in 5 and 7, having already appeared as 2 Ulster participants in the series of 4 brief alternating boasts preceding Ced MacMargach's assertion of his claims in 1. Mahindra had taunted an opponent with the killing of his brother, and Celtic had countered a boast by Coolroy's son Lugydd with my killing of Coolroy's brother Congantas MacDeddov and striking his head off him. Beheadings, which are highlighted in small capitals in the daggered sections, not only lead into Ced's spell of supremacy and mark its middle in 5, but also bring it to a dramatic end in 9, the rhetorically highlighted climactic encounter between Ced and the later rival Conall Cernach. When the latter claims to have killed a Connachtman daily and regularly slept with a Connachtman's head under his knee since taking arms, Ced concedes Connall's superiority and expresses regret that his own brother Arnlúin is not present to provide stronger opposition. But he is, says Connall, taking Arnlúin's head out of his belt and tossing it to Ced. Having boasted about the death of an opponent's brother in 1, Mahindra was bluntly informed in 5 about the recent taking of his firstborn son's head by Ced, who now gets spectacular comeuppance when his own brother's head is unexpectedly produced by Connall in a moment of pure drama. Ced's ascendancy is thus punctuated at key intervals by 3 increasingly poignant references to the loss of heads, each addressed to a close relative of the chief victim. The opening and closing challenges to Ced in B2 and B9 were made by Ulster's 3rd and 2nd ranking warriors respectively. Loigeris' regular epithet Buadach, victorious, was pointedly omitted from the account of a first expedition that was anything but. Connall succeeded where the others had failed, but proceeded to abuse the privilege of carving, first by egregious gluttony, and then by outrageous niggardliness towards the Connachtmen that provoked blows and bloodshed indoors, followed by a full-scale battle outside. The prominence of headhunting in Scéala Mucha is in keeping with the regularity with which slain enemies' heads are cut off as trophies in early Irish sagas. C1 on the handout refers to just 2 instances out of many. Of the tender age of 7, Cuchulainn successively defeated the 3 sons of Necht Scéine in single combat, beheaded them, and returned in triumph to Evan with these and other spoils on his already mentioned first expedition into enemy territory. Later in the time, he donned festive apparel to show himself to the enemy with 9 heads in one hand and 10 heads in the other, which he shook from him at the hosts as the trophy of a night's fighting. In C2, a similar Gaulish practice is mentioned disapprovingly by the Greek author Strabo on the eyewitness authority of Posidonius, while Polybius and Livy record particular incidents. The literary record is corroborated by archaeological evidence from the Iberian Peninsula, Gaul and Britain, and Caesar's Gaulish opponent Dumnorix minted coins bearing his name and an image of a warrior with a severed head in his left hand. I'll just give you a moment to look at that while. C3 contains attestations of similar practices in other Indo-European societies. Herodotus describes the Scythian taking of heads and preparation of trophies from them, and the Thracians to the south also displayed severed enemies' heads, to judge from Livy's account of an incident in 171 BC. Might be as well to just scroll down a little there. Striking Germanic instances include Tacitus' reference to the aftermath of the massacre of Varus legions in 15 BC, and Paul the Deacon's statement regarding a Lombard and a Gepid king. You see those on the handout there. According to Finlay, a trophy is lasting evidence to be displayed at all appropriate occasions. Among more primitive peoples, the victim's head served that honorific purpose. In Homer's Greece, armor replaced heads. Even so, the Iliad records the Trojans' declared intention of taking Menelaus' head home in revenge for his slain brother, and Hector's resolve to sever the head from Patroclus' corpse and display it on a stake, although neither was fulfilled. Moreover, in a Greek myth recorded by Apollodorus, Hippodamea's suitors were given a start in a chariot race by her father, Oenomaus, who cut off their heads and nailed them to his house for display after overtaking and killing them. Virgil mentions, again, we could perhaps, yes, that's right, slightly down again. Virgil mentions slain victims' heads hanging outside the entrance to the mythical Carcas cave in Italy, while Livy records the display of a Roman legate's head in battle by the neighbouring Aequi in 464 BC, and Cossus' tide-turning feat of riding against the Vean king, striking him from his horse, killing him with a spear, cutting off his head, and displaying it on a spike in 437 BC. It seems that major barbarian peoples of Europe in antiquity, such as the Scyths, Celts, and Teutons, retained a practice of headhunting already abandoned by the Greeks and Romans, albeit not without trace. The severing and keeping of heads looks like a medieval Irish survival of an ancient Celtic custom with probable Indo-European roots. The moral satire would be blunted somewhat if this was no more than a literary motif by the time of Scalamukki's composition, but C4 notes a striking real-life occurrence as late as 1169, the bringing of some 200 heads of enemies slain in battle against the Osriga to Diarmuid's MacMurchada, that is recorded in two separate accounts of the Norman invasion of Ireland by authors with direct access to some of those involved. C5 notes occasional references to the taking of an arm as a trophy or offering. After Cuchulainn had been killed in his death tale, Lugydd then arranged his hair behind him and smote his head from him. Thereafter his sword fell from Cuchulainn's hand and struck his arm from Lugydd, so that it was on the ground. His arm is then struck from Cuchulainn in revenge. Cuchulainn is, of course, a corpse at this time. The hosts then depart and take Cuchulainn's head and arm with them until they reach Tara. When Cuchulainn's foster brother, Conall Cana, caught up with Lugydd, he agreed to a fair fight with, Lugydd was by now one-armed, you'll recall, he agreed to a fair fight with one arm bound to his side, defeated him, and struck off his head. Thus, the sometimes one-eyed Cuchulainn, we'll come to that later, loses his head and takes Lugydd's arm off. His own arm is cut off, but this is requited when the temporarily one-armed Conall severs Lugydd's head. Herodotus records a Scythian practice of skinning victims' right arms to make covers for their quivers, and Strabo states that the Lusitanians of the Western Iberian Peninsula used to cut off and offer up the right hands of prisoners of war. We can also recall Grendel's shoulder and arm and hand and everything pulled off by Beowulf. That was left in the hall in that poem for quite a while as a sort of horrible trophy, I suppose. Certainly something to look at for us for a time. At this stage, perhaps, I'm sorry to have to do this to you, Patrick, perhaps we will go back to B and sections, the central sections 3 to 5. I've just got to talk about those a little bit. Key body parts are lost in 4 juxtaposed contests. A hand in B3, an eye in B4, heads in B5, and a foot in B6. 2 cases are generated by giving personal names an unexpected etymological twist. In B3, Lav Gravwydd, hand of danger, is understood as endangered hand, rather than more natural, dangerous hand. And in B6, Salchav, heel battler, is put down to its bearer's loss of a foot rather than to his fleetness of foot in battle. The above average risks of losing an eye or a limb through regular involvement in fighting are reflected by the modern stereotypes of the pirate with an eye patch, a hook for a hand, or a wooden leg, not to mention some famous real-life instances. Nelson lost an arm and the sight of an eye in battle on separate occasions, while the Iberian Peninsula's two 16th century literary giants, Portugal's Camões and Spain's Cervantes, lost an eye and the use of an arm, respectively, in military actions. I mean, you could do wonderful schemes with this, but it actually happened. It was by chance, so to speak, that there was this delightful complementary distribution. Loss of both eyes, arms, or legs would obviously end a fighting career, as one would think pretty much would loss of one leg or a foot. A missing arm or hand would be a serious inconvenience, especially on the right side, but loss of one eye was less likely to impair a warrior's effectiveness unduly. The narrative interchangeability of hand with arm and foot with leg as part and whole respectively did not of course apply to head and eye for very obvious reasons. Now, the frequency of references to a missing eye, hand or arm, foot or leg in medieval Irish and other sources suggests that although an occupational hazard for warriors, these impairments had acquired special significance. Ked's adjacent boasts in B3 and B5 about, B3 and B4 about cutting off the hand of one opponent's father and knocking out another opponent's eye bring to mind better known pairings of a one-eyed figure with another lacking a hand or arm, notably the Norse gods Odin and Tyr, and the Roman heroes Horatius Cocles, or Cyclops, and Mucius Scaevola, or left-handed. Dumézil has claimed, for instance, in the article cited in D1, I think we can now resume the sequence. I think people have probably seen enough of the actual sections there. So Dumézil has claimed, for instance, in the article cited in D1, that the German and Roman figures are reflexes of a Dieu born, lacking an eye, and a Dieu manchot, with only one hand or arm, complementary defects that characterize them as Western Indo-European counterparts of the sometimes paired, but never impaired, Vedic gods Varuna and Mitra, embodying twinned magical and contractual halves of a sovereign first function. Celtic was brought into the frame by De Vries' observation that Lug and Nuadu were also one-eyed and one-armed at key points in the medieval Irish saga Cath Mare Tuired. Dumézil's thesis was criticised in my article on the Cyclops and related figures in Studia Celtica 30, from which much of the evidence in D and arguments based upon it have been drawn. In D2, loss of a hand obliged Nuadu to abdicate in Cath Mare Tuired, and Congal's loss of an eye similarly entailed loss of the Tara kingship in the Old Irish law tract Bechretha. Shenachas Norelig states in relation to loss of an eye that a blemish or aniv was unfitting in a king of Tara, and significantly, this is the very term applied to the numerous left eyes put out and right hands hacked off by Cuchulainn in his final battle. You see that all, I think, on the handout there. Early Irish sources then typically treat a missing eye or hand not as a mark of sovereignty, but as an obstacle to, or even disqualification from it, in serious discord with Dumézil's hypothesis. Horatius Cocles and Mucius Scaevola are by no stretch of the imagination depicted as sovereign figures in classical sources, but as warriors pure and simple. Moreover, Dionysius and Plutarch maintain that Horatius was barred from future state service by a gammy leg, resulting from a spear through the buttock, as though not by being one-eyed. While the one-eyed Odin is king of the gods in Norse mythology and may have displaced the one-armed Tyr in that role, Ellis Davidson has presented good evidence that both were chiefly gods of war. Lug and Nuadu may be erstwhile deities euhemerized as kings, but battle occasioned the former's one-eyed performance and the latter's loss of an arm and kingship in Cathmage. It thus looks as though the common denominator of these and other one-eyed and one-armed Western figures was not sovereignty, but warfare. A single eye was a fundamental attribute of Odin's, but was only adopted temporarily by his arguable Celtic counterpart Lugh in a ritual that also involved hopping on one leg. One eye and one foot appear as a permanent combination in the medieval Welsh romance Owain in D3, a native origin being indicated by the absence of this feature in the corresponding passage in Chrétien's late 12th century Yvain. There's some relation between the two, but certainly this feature of the missing arm and leg are not in the French text, the old French text. One text describes the Fomorians as one-armed and one-legged, and there are even medieval Irish examples of figures lacking an eye too, such as Fair Calle in D3. Yes, you can see that there, I hope. Toggle written to Derriga. D4 is concerned with a spectacular but transient cyclopism that afflicted Cuchulainn when in the throes of a battle frenzy called Rheostruth, or warp spasm. The first example in the time, when he was but a boy, also involves fiery effects, as still more impressively does the second version as an adult, which also turns his legs the wrong way round. However, it was the one-eyed effect that his many female admirers chose to imitate in the passages cited from the sagas Talland Eidir and Sjöglige Concullin. The second description of Rheostruth calls it a saivleis diverge, thereby connecting it with the murderous practice of diverg, reaving, by the young members of Fian bands, as depicted, for instance, in the saga Togolvridna the Deraga in D5. If we just go down a little there. Excellent, thank you. So yes, that's the first paragraph there, where diverg is described as robbery and plunder and killing people and reaving, and then we go on to see that these people are actually Fianna too. Mulchu's 7th century Life of Patrick gives an early example of a cyclops engaged in killing as a diverg. Ingel Caich, the one-eyed, is a striking instance from Togolvridna the Deraga, and the one-eyed Feinith Gol has been discussed by Professor Nagy. D6 turns to Killeen's argument that the classical motif of a warrior with only one foot shod simulates one-leggedness. For instance, having lost a sandal in the river on his way, Jason reaches Iolcus wearing only one shoe in keeping with an oracular warning. Virgil describes Caeculus and his followers wearing wolfskin caps and single shoes. The one-shoed warrior seems to have been a real-life ritualized counterpart of the largely mythical one-footed fighter. Of course, the examples are mythical, but it's a real-life possibility, unlike the one foot. Caeculus' name is a derivative from caecus, by the suffix also seen in the name of Romulus, another herdsman's fosterling and leader of young brigands. Although caecus had come to mean blind in Latin, an original sense, blind in one eye, is guaranteed by the Celtic and Germanic cognates noted in D6. Obviously, we've got old Cornish there, Coig, Gothic Hex, and even Gloss, Monophthalmus, and so on. This implies a cyclops at the head of a wild band and invites comparison with the one-eyed Germanic deity Wodenaz, Odin in Norse, of course, with his following of berserk wolfskins, and perhaps also with a one-eyed Indian Rudra at the head of a wild divine band of Maruts or Rudras. A medieval Irish reflex may be seen in Cathmage Tureth, where Balor, with his huge eye, leads an invading host of Fomorians, who are described as having just one arm and one leg in another text we've already seen in D3. It seems from D7 that cyclopism was sufficiently prestigious for an eye to be deliberately offered up. Gimbutas notes that eyes were sacrificed at a sacred spring as late as the 16th century in her study of a one-eyed Lithuanian deity compared with the Germanic Odin. A similar pagan Nordic practice may once have correlated with the myth recorded in Snorri Sturluson's Gylfaginning of Odin's pledging an eye at Mimir's well. Finally, the combined testimony of Plutarch and Pausanias indicates that Lycurgus, or wolf actor, the legendary founder of ancient Sparta's militaristic social system, lost an eye and dedicated it to the goddess Athene. The deliberate sacrifice of a hand also figures in a couple of mythical or legendary narratives cited in D8. The lame Cyclops Horatius' defense of the Roman bridge forms a virtual diptych with a subsequent heroic action in the same brief war, namely Mucius' voluntary burning of his right hand as a token of his and his followers' determination. In Norse mythology, the already mentioned Tyr willingly risked his hand as a pledge for the release of the Fenris wolf, and duly lost it when the gods did not keep their promise. Far from supporting de Mézières' ascription of the born and manchot to his sovereign first function, the evidence clearly indicates the missing eye or a single hand or arm, to which should be added a lost foot or leg, ignored by de Mézières, enjoyed widespread regard as a highly visible casualty of eminently second function warfare. Such was the esteem for these defects as enduring symbols of their bearers' past or current military activity, that they acquired cultic and mythical significance in relation to a warrior's frenzy-induced prowess, and might even be self-inflicted or imitated ritually. Their status as badges of martial distinction is presumably why Cedd devotes a boast to each of them in turn in Schedulum Mcducho. However, that saga's author characteristically undermines the awe conventionally inspired by such disfigurements and converts them into emblems of shame or at least embarrassment by picturing an all too likely way of incurring them, namely demeaning defeat in combat. The final section, E, is concerned with Vultarius, a 1456-line Latin epic composed in the 9th or 10th century AD and quite widely read, to judge from the rather numerous surviving manuscript copies. References are to Strecker's standard edition published posthumously in the shorter and longer editions of 1947 and 1951 mentioned in E1. I use the Editio Minor, of which I have my own copy, so rather than the rather larger Monumenta version. The poem is notable for the first literary appearance of Hagen and King Gibbich's son and successor Gunther. The first literary appearance of Hagen and King Gibbich's son and successor Gunther, both prominent in the Middle High German Nibelungenlied, produced 2 or 3 centuries later, and thence in Götterdämmerung, the final opera of Wagner's monumental 19th century Ring tetralogy. I thought I'd better add that for Professor Nedge's benefit. I'm a Wagner fan myself too. Tantalizingly, Gunther of Worms and his eminent subject Hagen encounter an exceptional warrior who possesses an enviable hoard of treasure and goes on to marry a princess of note in both Vultarius and the Nibelungenlied, but I'll leave that matter there. More to the point here is Kratz's delineation of Vultarius in E2 as, in effect, a clerically composed satire of Germanic heroic practices and ideals from a Christian standpoint. Harvard's own professor, in 3 substantial articles cited in E2, Harvard's own Professor Ziolkowski has explored Christian and pagan elements in the epic's makeup and sought in the first of these, I quote, to follow the poet's lighter vein as it reveals itself in what may appear to be a most unexpected place, the massive bloodletting at the end of the poem. This will also be the focus here, and we shall see that resonances between Vultarius and Schedulum Mcducho, the more or less contemporary product of an Irish monastic milieu, include the prominence afforded to decapitation and to loss of an eye, a hand, and a foot or leg. The plot of Vultarius hinges on the decision of the Franks' king Gibbich to buy Attila and his Huns off with a huge treasure and a hostage namely the noble youth Hagen in lieu of Gibbich's underage son Gunther. The Burgundian king Hererich followed suit, giving up his daughter and only child Hildgund, along with countless treasures. Next came Aquitania, whose king Alfer had betrothed his son Walter to Hererich's daughter, but now provided tribute and his son as a hostage. Then, at lines 93 to 5, the Avars, finally laden with many treasures and having taken as hostages Hagen, the girl Hildgund, and Walter, returned joyfully. The rulers of Connaught and Ulster hardly covered themselves in glory at the end of Scale and Wicklow, as we've seen, and the three Germanic kings behaved even less gloriously at the start of Vultarius by following the timorous, Pawidus is used in the poem, Frankish king's lead in giving up without a fight. Hagen and Walter were treated like foster sons by Attila and won military laurels, while his queen's affection for Hildgund led to her being put in charge of the royal treasury. After Gibbich's death, his successor Gunther repudiated the treaty with the Huns, and hearing of this, Hagen escaped and returned home. Walter stayed on, winning more military glory, but eventually plotted and made good his escape with Hildgund after securing a war horse and loading it with chests full of treasure, provisions and equipment. After a scripturally suggested 40 days travelling clandestinely in the wilds, during which the praiseworthy hero Walter refrained from taking advantage of the maiden, they reached the Rhine near Worms and paid to be ferried across with non-local fish. These found their way to King Gunther's table, and inquiries revealed that they had come from a fully armed warrior accompanied by a girl and a horse bearing two sizable chests which jangled as if with gold and jewels. Hagen joyfully recognized that Walter had returned from the Huns, but Gunther's only concern was recovery of the treasure that Gibbich transferred to the Eastern King, as he put it, and he chose 12 of his best men for the purpose, including the reluctant Hagen. Walter, meanwhile, had found a narrow gorge in the Vosges to sleep in, and when warned of their approach by the watching Hildgund, was relieved to see that they were not Avars but Franks, including his former comrade Hagen. E3 presents the first instance of what might be termed Walter's schizophrenia, when his vow to hold on to his treasure at all costs is briefly repented, but nevertheless carried out. Firmly rejecting Gunther's offer through an envoy of his life in return for the horse, chests and girl, Walter did offer 100 armlets of red gold as a gesture to royalty. Hagen urged acceptance, warning of Walter's prowess and his own dream in E4, in which Gunther and he lost a lower leg and an eye plus some teeth to a bear. A well-known martial symbol, of course, in Germanic tradition. When accused by Gunther of hereditary timidity, Hagen angrily withdrew to a nearby hill to observe events. The envoy, Camillo, renewed Gunther's demand, but was again rebuffed, Walter sarcastically doubling his offer to 200 armlets if the Franks really insisted upon payment for passage through their territory by non-hostile strangers. Thus, whereas Gunther was irredeemably avaricious, Walter was at least prepared to surrender some of his treasure. Even so, Camillo initiated hostilities. A warrior's one-to-one confrontations with a series of different rivals play a major role in both Vultarius and the tale of Mcducho's pig. As summarized in E5, Walter prevails over 11 opponents in successive fights to the death that are often accompanied by boasts and/or insults, to which vigorous moralizing is added in the single combat with Hagen's nephew in 5F. In the Irish saga, Cedd gets the better of 7 opponents in a succession of verbal exchanges relating to wounds or deaths inflicted in earlier genuine conflicts between him and the other contestants or one of their close relatives. Certain wounds inflicted by Walter in E5 are highlighted in boldface. A whole arm is wrenched off in 5JK. Wounds to the legs feature in several others, and decapitations also occur. Walter's treatment of Patavrid's corpse in 5S suggests that, like a typical Irish warrior, he routinely removed heads of victims killed by other means, if practicable. After the loss of Tenastus and Trogus, they're the very last two, it should have been Gunther's turn to face Walter in single combat. But instead, fleeing with all determination to the alienated Hagen, he insistently sought and eventually gained his support. Having yielded to the claims of honour, duty, and his slain nephew, Hagen proposed an apparent withdrawal in order to entice Walter out of his impregnably narrow base. Gunther agreed, embraced and kissed Hagen, and the two of them sought a suitable place for a surprise attack. Unsure whether the visibly reconciled pair had returned to the city for reinforcements or were lurking nearby, Walter decided to stay put and rest until morning, lest he be accused of absconding by night like a thief. After fortifying the defile's entrance and tying up the 6 horses now in his possession, Walter suffered a dramatic second onset of schizophrenia, noted in E6. Carefully reuniting the heads that he had severed with their bodies, and contritely praying for his and his victims' salvation. Nevertheless, on the morrow, he proceeded to strip the corpses of their arms and armour, but not their tunics and underwear. After placing the booty on 4 horses and Hiltgund on the 5th, he himself took the 6th together with the treasure chests, and they set out. Insofar as all of the deaths and other losses in Vultarius followed from Gunther's uncontrollable urge to possess the treasures stolen from Attila by Hiltgund and guarded with determination by Walter, Hagen's despairing diatribe against avarice as the root of all evil in E5F, I think you will have seen that, may be regarded as the epic's moral heart. Similar misgivings are implied by Walter's 2 acts of contrition, neither of which prevented him from preserving his stolen treasure intact at the cost of 11 lives and augmenting it afterwards with his victims' spoils. Hagen's passing outburst and Walter's brief interludes of repentance reflect tensions between martial mores and Christian ideals by, in effect, using the pair's own thoughts, words, and/or gestures of regret as a Christian critique of their more usual attitudes and actions as fierce warriors bound by a strict martial and social code. Schizophrenia's representation of the taking of heads was calculated to bring the practice's brutality into sharp relief, and the poet of Vultarius presumably intended a similar impression to be made by his hero's contrite desire to reunite his victims' torsos with the heads that he had himself deliberately severed. Hiltgund soon espied 2 men approaching and urged flight, but Walter declared his preference to a beautiful death over solitary escape and loss of possessions, sent her to shelter with the treasure-laden horse, and awaited his foe on a mountain slope. His resolve to face 2 adversaries, rather than fleeing, contrasted sharply with Gunther's avoidance of single combat by flight and return to the fray only after securing a 2-to-1 advantage. After some preliminaries, there ensued the fierce and dramatic battle briefly summarised in E7. Gunther's loss of his lower leg and Hagen's loss of an eye plus some teeth, in accordance with his earlier dream, were punctuated by Walter's unforeseen loss of his right hand. Thus the 3 fighters shared the insignia, as the poet puts it, of a missing foot, hand, and eye, instead of the Avar armlets. Hiltgund obeyed Walter's instructions to bind their wounds and present wine to Hagen first, to Walter second, and on account of his feeble performance to Gunther last. Hagen's insistence that Walter receive the first draft resulted in the highest ranking participant being placed the distant last in valour, his vassal Hagen second, and the king's son Walter first. After dismissing the one-legged Gunther as a military non-entity, the one-eyed and partially toothless Hagen and the one-handed Walter mock each other's wounds and their future inconvenience in E8. The pair then renewed their friendship. Hagen took the woebegone Gunther back to Worms, and Walter returned happily to his parents, marriage to Hiltgund, and a successful reign in Aquitania. Crouch's view of the techniques and objectives of the author of Vultarius in E9 is comparable with the manipulation of inherited native characters and tropes to convey a Christian message in Scala Muccia Mcducho. In the Irish tale, Humiliations and fatalities on both sides ended in futility, with the killing of the hounds selfishly sought by the rival rulers of Connaught and Ulster. In the Carolingian epic, all that the pusillanimous Gunther has to show for his avarice was the loss of his own lower leg, Hagen's eye plus teeth, and the lives of 11 top followers. Even the heroic Walter's retention of the stolen treasure came at the high price of losing his hitherto weapon-holding right hand. The monastic authors of Vultarius and Schizophrenia were doubtless well aware of Christ's advice to get rid of a hand, foot, or eye if it tempted one to sin, since entry to heaven with a defect was better than being sent unprepared and unimpaired to the fires of hell. However, even if a hint of atonement for temptation and sin by pain and loss in this world as a means of avoiding hellfire in the next was intended by either or both, that was hardly their main aim. After all, the gospel enjoins deliberate self-inflicted excision of an offending eye or limb as a path to salvation, whereas our two narratives represent loss of the same as the most unfortunate outcome of an enemy assault. Vultarius also agrees with the Irish saga in avoiding any suggestion that the insignia of missing body parts might be a source of future pride. Gunther's loss of his lower leg is represented as an agonizing disability resulting from his martial inadequacy. Walter's one-handedness as an embarrassing inconvenience to be concealed as far as possible, and Hagen's lack of an eye as an impediment to seeing straight. Both works thus seem to have singled out these particular three losses of a normally visible body part for disparagement. To judge from the comparative mythical and legendary evidence, this was because prestige had traditionally been accorded them over a large part of Europe by speakers of Celtic, Germanic, and other Indo-European languages. As a component of what Kratz terms pagan heritage deemed ripe for re-evaluation, this trio of physical defects is incorporated by the continental Latin poem and the Irish tale into a broader Christian critique of inherited warrior practices, beliefs, and values. Direct influence of one work upon the other seems unlikely, and these parallels between them are rather due to their authors' similar situations as monastic men of letters drawing upon native narrative traditions, Irish and West Germanic respectively, in order to question or even ridicule patently unchristian norms of warrior conduct and key associated symbols or emblems. These included the routine removal of heads and the conventionally honourable disfigurements of a missing eye, hand, arm, or foot leg that figure prominently in both works. Whether they resulted from shared Indo-European inheritance, from early diffusion between neighbouring Celtic, Germanic, and other peoples in Europe, or from some combination of the two, these similarities seem too circumstantial to be due to coincidence. The basic point is that, as far as the Christian authors of Vultarius and Mcducho were concerned, all four features were obvious targets as tangible survivals of morally reprehensible pagan practice and ideology. Paradoxically, that also makes both works valuable sources of information about that pagan background. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Kim, for a thorough and very thought-provoking presentation. There's so much to think about there. By the way, I should point out to everyone that this talk is being recorded or was recorded, and it will be available via the departmental website. Patrick, you can correct me there. And by the way, thank you, Patrick, so much for having kept up with the PowerPoint and made our reception.
May I enthusiastically second those thanks. Thank you very much indeed, Patrick. Yes.
And thank you for a PowerPoint, or thank you for a handout, Kim. That's definitely worth keeping, and that has so much value to it.